If you're drawn to real-life mysteries, dark secrets, and stories that keep you up at night, you're in the right place. We uncover the chilling truths behind the world's most disturbing crimes. No faces, no fluff, just facts, fear, and unforgettable twists. Like what you hear? Smash the like button. Want more gripping stories? Hit that subscribe button. Don't miss a single case, turn on notifications and stay ahead of the truth. This isn't just crime. This is the dark side of human nature, exposed. From the outside looking in, the DeLongs were a portrait of the American dream. A dream so carefully curated, it seemed airbrushed. Charles DeLong, Harvard-educated cardiologist, philanthropist, and partner at one of Denver's top heart centers, was the kind of man who shook hands with hospital donors in the morning and saved lives by lunchtime. His wife, Julia, an elegant former ballet dancer turned lifestyle influencer, filled their social feeds with photos of candlelit dinners, his and hers vacations, and coordinated Christmas pajamas. They lived in a $2.5 million estate tucked away in Cherry Creek, where the sidewalks sparkled at dusk and every mailbox stood like a monument to wealth. Neighbors called them the DeLong dynasty, not because they were royalty, but because they ruled every gala, every charity board, and every PTA fundraiser with charm, charisma, and champagne. But the thing about picture-perfect lives is this. Zoom in close enough, and you'll start to see the cracks. Inside their mansion, the silence was loud. Julia and Charles had stopped sharing a bed nearly a year earlier. Charles often stayed late at work, citing emergency surgeries. Julia filled her days recording skincare tutorials in soft lighting and captioning Instagram photos with phrases like, "grateful for the little things." But behind the captions and carefully angled filters was a woman spiraling, lonely, restless, and tired of pretending. She had once danced the lead in Giselle, lithe and graceful on stages in Los Angeles and Austin. But after her career-ending ACL injury and their move to Denver, she traded spotlights for designer aprons and high thread count linens. She smiled for followers, posed with teacups, but at night she cried herself to sleep in the guest room with a glass of rose in hand. Charles had noticed the change. The way Julia barely looked up from her phone when he entered a room. How she stopped asking how his day went. She was always posting, always scrolling, always lost in a curated world of likes and longing. He tried to bring her back, weekend getaways, lavish gifts, date nights with Michelin stars. But the more he reached, the further she slipped away. Charles didn't confront Julia, he confronted Michael. In a heated exchange at a job site, Charles told him to end the affair or he'd make his life hell. Michael laughed it off. But Julia, when told, panicked. That night, she made a call to her best friend that would later be played in court. "I can't lose both men," she whispered. In truth, she was already plotting how to avoid losing either, by removing one. And then came the sunroom project. It was supposed to be simple. A renovation to bring more natural light into their aging home. Julia had begged for it for months, imagining golden hour selfies in the new glass-walled atrium. She wanted a content sanctuary, she told Charles. Something to brighten the mood. Charles agreed. Maybe it would bring a little warmth back into the home, literally and figuratively. He had no idea that with the sunroom would come the shadows. That's when Julia met Michael Arnett. The contractor. 38. Handsome. Divorced. Tattooed forearms and a habit of calling her darlin'. Julia offered him lemonade. He offered compliments. She watched him work, lingering too long in doorways. They laughed over blueprints, exchanged playlists, and soon, more. Charles, busy with 14-hour shifts at the hospital, didn't notice at first. Julia, for once, was humming again. She wore makeup on weekdays. She lingered by the window when Michael's truck pulled in. She started checking on the progress multiple times a day, even when the workers weren't there. To outsiders, nothing seemed off. The DeLongs still smiled at galas. Still donated to children's hospitals. Still posted about their blessed life. But inside the DeLong mansion, a storm was building. It wasn't loud. It wasn't fast. It was quiet. Calculated. And fueled by a passion too dark to name. By the time Charles began asking questions, why is the project taking so long? Why does Julia never return his calls during the day? It was already too late. What started as a casual flirtation would soon ignite a deadly obsession. They say affairs start in whispers. Not with declarations. Not with fireworks. Just a glance that lingers too long. A joke that isn't quite appropriate. A smile that holds too much meaning. Julia DeLong's affair with Michael Arnett didn't begin in a bed. It began in a half-finished sunroom, with sawdust in the air and tension so thick, it hummed. Michael wasn't like the world Charles belonged to. He didn't wear cufflinks or carry an embroidered stethoscope. He didn't speak in measured, clinical tones. He was blunt. Confident. The kind of man who flirted with his eyes and didn't care who saw. He smelled like sweat and cedarwood. He joked about Julia's perfume, said it made the whole house smell expensive. She laughed. Too hard. Too long. At first, it was harmless. Julia told herself she just liked the attention. She'd forgotten what it felt like to be looked at like that. Not like a wife. Not like a mother. Like a woman. She told her best friend it was a silly crush. She told herself it was nothing real. But by the third week of the renovation, Julia was leaving the house in designer dresses and full makeup, only to return an hour later with takeout and an excuse to check on the workers. The only worker there was Michael. And Michael wasn't blind. It wasn't long before they kissed. It happened on a Wednesday. The rain had chased off the rest of the crew. Michael stayed to finish the flooring. Julia brought him coffee. The air was electric. She leaned in to point at something in the blueprints, and instead, their lips met. It wasn't soft. It wasn't gentle. It was hungry. Fast. And dangerous. From that moment, everything changed. They became reckless. Julia started lying about weekend yoga retreats. Michael stopped answering calls from other clients. Julia left gifts in his truck, cologne, homemade pastries, even a designer watch. She said he deserved better. Michael, who'd been through 2 divorces, saw something in Julia he hadn't seen in years: devotion. He was hooked. But what Julia didn't see, or maybe didn't want to see, was how quickly Michael was falling. And how tightly he'd cling to her once he did. Meanwhile, Charles began noticing things. Receipts that didn't match Julia's stories. Unanswered calls. Locked doors. He asked questions, but Julia deflected. Said he was paranoid. Said he was working too hard and imagining things. But she knew, deep down, he suspected. One night, Charles came home early. Julia wasn't there. Her phone went straight to voicemail. The only light on in the house was in the sunroom. There, on the corner table, was a coffee mug, not his, and not Julia's usual brand. A local shop miles across town. A place Michael frequented. He sat in the dark for an hour, staring at the mug. When Julia came home, flustered, hair wet from the shower, Charles said nothing. But something inside him clicked. From that moment, he started watching her. Julia, meanwhile, spiraled further into the affair. She began writing in her journal again, first as therapy, then as fantasy. She described Michael in detail. Wrote pages about a future they could share, about what it would be like if Charles just disappeared. She imagined selling the house. Running away. A cabin in Telluride. Maybe even a child. Michael told her they'd figure it out. That they could have it all, if Charles wasn't in the way. One night, over drinks in a secluded bar outside town, Michael whispered 4 words that would forever alter their future. What if he died? Julia didn't answer. But she didn't stop him, either. That night, she wrote only 1 sentence in her journal. There's more than one way to end a marriage. The fantasy was no longer just a fantasy. There are moments in every marriage when the silence becomes louder than words. For Charles DeLong, that moment came one night over dinner. Julia, across the table, was swirling her wine with one hand and scrolling through her phone with the other. She hadn't looked up once. He cleared his throat. She didn't flinch. That's when he knew. Whatever they once had, it was gone. But something else, something darker, had taken its place. Charles had been playing detective for weeks now. Checking credit card statements. Calling the spa to confirm appointments Julia never showed up for. Once, he even followed her, just for a few minutes. It felt dirty, but necessary. That's how he found her car parked outside Michael Arnett's apartment complex on a rainy Thursday afternoon. She was there for 3 hours. He didn't confront her that night. He didn't scream. Instead, he did something worse. He waited. The next morning, Charles showed up at Michael's construction site. No suit. No smile. No pretense. He stood quietly until Michael noticed him. Then he spoke, low and steady. Whatever this is, it ends now. Michael smirked. Said Julia was a grown woman. Said maybe Charles should ask himself why she was looking elsewhere. Charles didn't take the bait. But the message had been delivered. And Michael was rattled. Julia was furious when she found out. How dare you confront him, she snapped that night. You're the one who abandoned me, she hissed, shoving a wine glass into the sink so hard it shattered. Charles didn't respond. He just stared at her, long and slow, and asked one question. Are you in love with him? Julia didn't answer. She just turned and walked upstairs, barefoot over broken glass. That night, Julia called her best friend, Mara, sobbing. A call that would later be played back in the courtroom. I can't lose both men, she whispered. If I leave Charles, he'll destroy me. But Michael, he makes me feel alive again. There was panic in her voice. desperation. But no remorse. And then came the turning point. Julia sent Michael a text that would later become Exhibit A. "I'm tired of feeling trapped. I wish he'd just vanish." To Michael, it was more than a cry for help. It was a call to action. The next day, Michael purchased an unregistered burner phone. The day after that, Julia searched online for how to permanently delete iCloud backups. Charles, meanwhile, hired a private investigator. He wanted proof. Not for the courts. Not even for leverage. For himself. He needed to know that he wasn't crazy. That the woman he once loved was truly gone. He didn't expect to find more than infidelity. He didn't expect to hear plans. But that's exactly what the private investigator brought him. Recordings. Photos. A voice note of Julia asking Michael, would a house fire look like an accident if he was asleep? That night, Charles moved his personal documents to a fireproof safe. He changed his will. And he wrote a letter, dated, signed, sealed, addressed to his younger brother, Elliot. The letter would not be opened until 2 months later. By then, Charles would already be dead. Charles saw it coming. He tried to prepare. But he didn't realize that love, when twisted by obsession, becomes something else entirely. It happened just after midnight. December 4, 2022. A 911 call cut through the static at the Denver Fire Department's dispatch desk. The voice on the other end was frantic. A neighbor on South Garfield Street reported thick smoke curling out of the DeLong's estate, windows glowing orange, alarms shrieking through the night. Within minutes, fire trucks descended on the upscale Cherry Creek neighborhood. The flames were already raging by the time the first responders kicked in the door. But what they found inside wasn't just fire. It was murder. Inside, in the back study, once Charles's favorite place to unwind with medical journals and jazz records, firefighters found his lifeless body slumped in a leather chair, his hands duct-taped behind his back, a trail of blood trailing from his nose to his collarbone. He was dead before the fire started. The autopsy would later confirm what detectives suspected. Charles DeLong had been drugged, bludgeoned, and left unconscious in the chair as the fire was set around him. He never had a chance. News of the fire spread fast. By morning, Julia DeLong was already in the spotlight, not for her grief, but for her conspicuous absence. She hadn't been home that night. She told police she'd stayed overnight at her mother's house across town after a difficult argument with Charles. But her story wobbled from the start. Security cameras in her mother's neighborhood never showed Julia's arrival. Neighbors never saw her car. And the GPS ping from her phone? It placed her in Sloan Lake, near a small apartment complex, where Michael Arnett lived. Investigators grew suspicious. They pulled Michael's phone records. At 9:42 p.m., less than 3 hours before the fire, a message was sent from Julia's number. He's in the study. Door unlocked. You know what to do. Michael claimed he never saw the message. He told police he'd been asleep, alone, and had nothing to do with the fire. But when officers searched his truck, they found a burned matchbook from Ristorante Luca, the exact restaurant Julia was seen picking up takeout from that evening. More damning still. Traces of accelerant were found on Michael's clothes, chemicals that matched the remnants at the fire site. When Julia was brought in for questioning, she was calm. Too calm. She stuck to her alibi, never raising her voice, never shedding a tear. She said Charles had been distant and depressed, that maybe he'd taken his own life. A house that big, an accident like that could happen to anyone. But detectives weren't buying it. Then came the break. A search of Julia's email uncovered a draft, never sent, never deleted, typed just 2 days before the fire. We could be free if we're careful. If he doesn't wake up, it will all look accidental. It was enough for a warrant. Enough for an arrest. Both Julia and Michael were charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and arson. But in a cruel twist, both pointed the finger at each other. Julia claimed Michael acted alone. That he had become obsessed with her and took things too far. Michael claimed Julia was the mastermind, the puppeteer pulling his strings with promises of love and a fresh start. In truth, they both had blood on their hands. And Charles had seen it coming. Remember that letter? The one Charles had sealed weeks earlier? It was finally opened by his younger brother, Elliot, after the funeral. Inside were just 3 lines. If I die suddenly, it wasn't an accident. Check Julia's phone. And tell her I loved her anyway. The trial of Julia DeLong and Michael Arnett began 6 months after the fire that destroyed not just a house, but a life. The Denver courthouse was packed. Reporters lined the marble steps, microphones aimed like weapons. Inside, the tension was thicker than the Colorado heatwave. Julia arrived in a sharp black blazer, her hair swept into a soft bun. No makeup, no jewelry. She didn't look like the woman from Instagram anymore. She looked like a widow. A defendant. A woman with everything to lose. Michael arrived separately, in shackles. His public defender barely looked at him. He looked smaller than he had in the photos, sunken eyes, twitching fingers, lips dry from nerves. They were no longer lovers. Now, they were each other's alibi and executioner. The prosecution came out swinging. They opened with a bombshell. Over 3,200 text messages exchanged between Julia and Michael in the 60 days leading up to the murder. Messages that weren't just romantic, they were incriminating. I dream of you. But I can't breathe with him here. I want him gone. Do you think fire leaves a trace? The courtroom went dead silent when those words were read aloud. Julia's attorneys objected. They argued the messages were figurative, nothing more than passion-fueled venting. But the jury wasn't buying it. Then came the surveillance footage. Julia told investigators she hadn't seen Michael that night. But a restaurant security camera showed her handing off a takeout bag to Michael in a dimly lit parking lot at 9:08 p.m., 3 hours before the fire began. And he wasn't alone in the video. He was holding a red gas can. Julia's defense was simple: she was being used. She claimed Michael had become possessive and obsessive. That she had tried to end the affair multiple times but he wouldn't let go. That he was the one who killed Charles in a jealous rage, hoping it would force her to be with him forever. Michael's defense? The opposite. He said Julia manipulated him. That she dangled promises of a new life. That she was the one who suggested the fire. That she researched the chemicals. That she told him, in no uncertain terms, that if he really loved her, he would do this one thing. It was her plan, he said on the stand. I was just the match. But then came the twist. Michael's cellmate came forward, called as a surprise witness. He told the jury that Michael had confessed everything while awaiting trial. According to him, Michael said, "She didn't even touch the fire. I poured the gas. I lit the match. I thought we'd run away together. But once her husband was gone, she stopped calling." The courtroom erupted. Julia's defense team demanded a mistrial. The judge denied it. It became clear to the jury that this wasn't just murder. It was emotional warfare. Two people. One obsession. Both willing to sacrifice a life, then each other. Julia's final testimony was the most haunting. Calm, composed, and eerily flat, she said. I loved Charles once. But he stopped seeing me. Michael saw me. He made me feel alive. I didn't want anyone to die, but I didn't stop it either. Her voice didn't crack. Her eyes didn't blink. It was the most honest, and chilling, moment of the entire trial. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for just 7 hours. The verdict? Guilty. Julia DeLong. First-degree murder. Arson. Conspiracy to commit murder. Michael Arnett. Second-degree murder. Arson. Tampering with evidence. Julia received life without parole. Michael received 38 years. As she was led out of the courtroom, Julia turned back, not to her lawyer, not to her parents, but toward Elliot DeLong. She mouthed something. The cameras didn't catch it. But a court reporter, sitting just 3 feet away, said she whispered, "I really did love him." No one knew if she meant Charles, or Michael. Sometimes, the dead speak through whispers we almost overlook. In the case of Dr. Charles DeLong, it wasn't just the fire patterns or the hidden USB drive that unraveled the truth, it was Rachel's most private words. Her diary. Tucked away in a nightstand drawer, beneath a stack of old magazines scorched by smoke, investigators recovered a small, leather-bound book. The edges were singed, the cover stiff with water damage from the fire hoses. But inside, the pages were intact. And what they revealed was more damning than any forensic test. The first entries painted a portrait of loneliness. Julia wrote of dinner nights gone cold, conversations with Charles that felt more like polite transactions than love. She spoke of a man, too busy healing everyone else to notice his own home was bleeding. But then the tone shifted. By late summer, her entries carried a new name. One she always underlined, Michael. Michael makes me feel seen. When he looks at me, it's like I exist again. But the guilt, it eats me alive. Charles deserves more than this. What struck detectives most was the transition from affection to fear. Julia's handwriting, once fluid, became jagged and rushed. The entries hinted at secrets too heavy to bear. She says Charles is in the way. Michael talks about fire like it's a door we just have to walk through. I'm terrified. But if I tell Charles, everything ends. Her last entry was just a single line, written the night before the fire. Tomorrow, something changes. For prosecutors, Julia's diary became more than words on paper. It was a blueprint of betrayal and manipulation. It showed a woman torn between loyalty to her husband and obsession with her lover, and a man who whispered promises of freedom through destruction. In court, when the diary was read aloud, the silence was suffocating. Jurors weren't just hearing evidence, they were reading Julia's unraveling in her own hand. Her secrets survived the flames. And in surviving, they turned against her. Julia DeLong hadn't meant for anyone to read her private thoughts. But in the end, her diary testified for her. And what it revealed lit the path straight to the truth. Sometimes the smallest details break the biggest cases. For detectives, that detail came from Julia's younger brother, Caleb. While helping investigators walk through the burned-out remains of the DeLong home, Caleb recalled Julia's odd request just weeks before the fire. She had asked him to install shelving in the basement. But she was strangely insistent, picking and rejecting spots on the wall, making him run the stud finder again and again. "Not there," she said. "Anywhere but there." To detectives, that sounded less like indecision, and more like a hiding place. Inside the wall cavity, they found what Julia had tried to bury. $9,200 in cash. A prepaid burner phone with unsent draft texts. A USB stick. And photographs of Julia with Shane Turner in a motel room. But it was the USB that stunned investigators. The footage, taken from a nanny cam Julia had hidden in her office, showed Shane entering while Charles was away. He carried no tools, only a black box. He rummaged through her desk, removed documents, and left. On the burner phone, draft texts hinted at coercion. "If you back out now, I'll tell him everything. Get the papers signed. Then we're free." Julia never sent them. She had only saved them. Her wall wasn't just drywall. It was a vault of secrets, and it cracked the case wide open. In the cold light of the interrogation room, Shane Turner tried to maintain control. He sat stiff, arms folded, eyes carefully composed. To the untrained eye, he was calm. But detectives Trey Jimenez and Marla Connors knew how to spot the cracks. "Shane," Jimenez began gently, "we found the USB drive." Shane froze. He blinked once, too long. "USB drive," he said smoothly, but his voice wavered. Then came the photographs, Julia and Shane together. Confronted, Shane admitted to a brief fling. But when detectives rolled footage of him entering the DeLong home and leaving with papers, his composure faltered. "It's not what it looks like," he muttered. The breaking point came when detectives read aloud the unsent messages from Julia's burner phone. "You said she wrote those," Jimenez pressed. "But how would you know what was in her drafts unless you saw them yourself?" Shane stammered. The silence swallowed him. And in that silence, detectives heard guilt. The tapes didn't capture a confession. But they captured something equally powerful, Shane's lies unraveling under the weight of truth. For weeks after the fire, Julia remained silent in court. But silence cannot erase betrayal. In her private correspondence, emails, diary entries, and hidden phone records, Julia's double life was laid bare. The affair, the fear, the promises whispered in motel rooms. But when confronted, Julia tried to turn the narrative. She painted Shane as a jealous handyman, obsessed with her, pushing her into corners she never wanted. She claimed she never spoke of insurance, never whispered about fire, never plotted Charles's death. But Julia's own words contradicted her. Her diary testified to her guilt. Her burner phone testified to her intent. And prosecutors reminded jurors that Julia, Charles's wife, had signed the life insurance increase herself. In the gallery, Charles's brother whispered through tears. She stood beside him at church every Sunday, and planned his funeral on Monday. For the jury, the widow's words rang hollow. And when she finally looked up at the photos of Charles projected on the courtroom screen, her face betrayed not grief, but fury. The case came down to two things, the fire and the money. Forensic fire experts reconstructed the blaze. It hadn't spread randomly. Accelerant had been poured deliberately, in pools that led to Charles's study. And residue from that same accelerant was found on Shane's jacket. Then came the insurance records. 6 weeks before the fire, Julia had increased Charles's life insurance by $2 million, with Shane listed as the signing witness. Days later, Shane's account showed thousands in unexplained cash deposits. Julia had the policy. Shane had the skills. Together, they had the motive. But in the courtroom, their alliance fractured. Julia blamed Shane. Shane claimed Julia masterminded everything. And in one unguarded moment on the interrogation tape, Shane let slip. "She told me he had to be gone. That we'd be rich and happy, and..." He stopped himself. But it was too late. The verdict came swiftly. Both Julia DeLong and Shane Turner were convicted of first-degree murder, arson, and insurance fraud. Their love, once written in motel rendezvous and whispered promises, now etched permanently into sentencing records. Dr. Charles DeLong's life ended in fire. But in the ashes, the truth burned brighter than the lies that tried to smother it. The matchbook. The accelerant. The insurance. The lover's betrayal. It wasn't just fire that killed Charles DeLong. It was greed, obsession, and the illusion of a perfect life gone to ash. The mansion in Cherry Creek stands empty now. Its walls blackened, its windows boarded. A silent monument to a man who healed countless hearts, only to have his own destroyed in betrayal. Dr. Charles DeLong never made headlines for his work. He never sought attention for the lives he saved in operating rooms across Denver. His name became known only in death, through the twisted greed of a wife who stopped loving him, and a contractor who mistook obsession for devotion. In the end, it wasn't the flames that killed Charles. It was the choices of those closest to him. Matches and motive, greed and lust, all colliding in one night that turned a picture-perfect life to ash. At the trial, Charles's brother, Elliot, spoke just once. His voice was quiet, almost swallowed by the noise of the cameras. You can burn a house. You can destroy a life. But the truth, it always survives the fire. Today, the DeLong home remains abandoned. But neighbors say on still nights, you can hear the creak of its ruined frame, whispering reminders of what was lost, and what can never be undone. And so we leave you with this question: how far would someone you love go, for freedom? For money? For passion? Leave your thoughts below, because sometimes, the scariest crimes are the ones closest to home. The house on Garfield Street may be silent now, but its story will echo for years to come. What do you think? Was this love gone wrong, or a crime of pure greed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story as chilling as we did, don't forget to like this video. It helps us bring more true stories like this to light. And make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you'll never miss the next case we uncover. Because in the world of true crime, the truth always survives the fire.